I found a night shift job on Indeed. They paid me $2,000 per night to watch over a dead woman's ashes. I was getting ready to sleep when I received the call. It was from a no-caller ID. I sat there at the edge of the bed, my phone in my ear. I could hear someone clearing their throat from the other end of the line, and then a deep, formal voice piped up, "Good evening. Am I speaking to Alex Adiemi?" "You are," I answered. "Who's this?" I was up to my neck in cold calls from strangers who wanted to sell me car insurance and was ready to tear the caller a new one when he explained, "I'm calling about the caregiver role for Granger Manor." Those words chased the sleep out of my eyes. I sat up straight. Me and my girlfriend were saving up for our wedding. But with only 10 months left, we needed every penny we could get. I needed a part-time job, and I needed one fast. But finding a good, decent job these days is like finding water in the Sahara. So, it's no surprise that I applied for this caregiver vacancy 2 minutes after it went live on Indeed. "We liked your CV, and would like to invite you for an interview," the caller continued. His voice was soft, silky smooth. It was so smooth that it was almost unnerving. He sounded like one of those ASMR YouTubers. "Would you be free tomorrow morning? 8:30 a.m., to be exact." I didn't miss a beat. "I'll be there." I never expected them to call me back half an hour after I applied. 11 at night, no less. But I just assumed they were as desperate for employees as I was to earn some money on the side. It was a match made in heaven. The interview was done over Zoom. The next morning, I sat at my dining room table, hunched over my laptop, headphones pressing into my ears as I joined the call. The video call flickered to life, and a middle-aged man appeared on my screen. He introduced himself as Damien. No surnames, just Damien. He looked as professional as he sounded. Slick back dark hair as black as night, well-groomed beard, suit and tie. He smiled, but if there was even a shred of warmth left in that smile, it didn't reach his pale blue eyes. The corners of his mouth were pulled back just a little too far, revealing teeth that were unnaturally even and white, as if he had spent a lifetime polishing them to perfection. He asked all the usual questions. "What are your weaknesses? What do you believe are the most important qualities for a caregiver to possess? And how do you demonstrate them? Why do you think you're a good fit for this company?" I bullshitted my way through the interview. I asked a few questions of my own, too. There were barely any traces of the care home on the internet, and I was curious about that. Damien glanced up at me. His smile never wavered, but his eyes held a flicker of something unreadable. It looked a little like a surprise. "Ah, yes," he began, his voice measured and calm. "We pride ourselves on maintaining a private and exclusive environment for our residents. Many of them prefer a more discreet approach, away from the prying eyes of the public." It sounded like he was reading from a rehearsed script. I ignored the red flags. Looking back at it, I ignored a lot of red flags. Money sometimes makes you blind. In the end, I got the job. I started work the next evening. I kissed Celine goodbye and was out the door. The place was a 45-minute drive from our house, in the crack in the middle of nowhere. Frank Ocean sang his heart out on the car radio as I sped through the highway on a foggy night. The long road ran through the woods, and I drove past miles and miles of tall birch trees that stretched up to the cloudy sky. All around me, there was nothing but forest. The care home was nestled at the end of a quiet street in a gated community. It was a small, old-school bungalow with neatly trimmed bushes and colorful flower beds on the lawn. I parked up, stepped out, and headed to the front door. Just as I raised my hand to knock, the door creaked open, revealing a tall man in the dimly lit hallway. "Good evening," Damien said, with that smooth yet hollow voice. "Alex, was it?" I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "Yes, that's right." I shook his hands. "Nice to meet you." Something about the man gave me unease. "Come in," he said, stepping aside with an almost mechanical grace. "We've been expecting you. Is there anything to drink? Coffee? Water?" "No, thanks, I'm good." The door closed behind me with a soft thud. The tall man gestured for me to follow him down a narrow hallway, and with each step, the unease in my chest tightened its grip. The radio was playing softly in the background. As I listened, the crackly voice became clearer. We interrupt our regularly scheduled programming to bring you a special report. We have just received word that Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, has been attacked by Japanese forces. I repeat, Pearl Harbor has been attacked. Damien must have noticed my curiosity. You're probably wondering why we play old news broadcasts like this one. He chimed in, his voice steady. It's not just for nostalgia's sake, although that does play a part. It's about keeping a connection to the past alive, especially for our older residents. Now that he mentioned it, the entire house looked like it was frozen in time. The furniture in the living room matched the vintage feel. Plush armchairs with floral upholstery sat alongside polished wooden side tables. A few framed black and white photographs adorned the walls, capturing memories from what seemed like a distant past. Smiling faces at family gatherings, couples dancing at social events, a little girl building a sandcastle, a slender ballerina posing on her tiptoes. Even the light fixtures, with their frosted glass shades, seemed to belong to another era. The soft, dim glow they poured into the room added to the cozy yet eerie atmosphere. It looked how you'd expect an old people's home to look. There was only one thing missing. Where are all the residents? I thought out loud. Damien stopped abruptly. Apart from the ticking of the grandfather clock on the wall and the crackle of wood from the fireplace, there was no sound apart from the news reporter on the radio. He turned to me with that signature smile that was stitched onto his face. His eyes paled as snow. I must inform you that the nature of this role is quite unique. He cleared his throat. Alex, you see, the resident you will be providing companionship to is not a living person. Say what the words caught in my throat. The individual in question is not alive. Well, at least not in the conventional sense. You will be tasked with watching over their ashes. He went on. This is an afterlife care agency. We care for those whom society has forgotten. Those who passed away with a dying wish to be remembered and loved from beyond the grave. Many of our clients are folks who died alone, with no one in their lives. There are no living husbands or wives, no children, and no friends to mourn their losses. As he spoke, my gaze drifted to a corner of the room where a small, ornate urn rested on a side table. It dawned on me that the client in question was the pile of cremated ashes in that urn. We're understaffed at the moment, so we've had to outsource some of our work across the country. It's a rather unconventional responsibility, I understand. So if this isn't what you were expecting, it's perfectly fine. I was on my way to the door before he even finished his sentence. Oh, hell nah. The pay would be $2,000 per night, he added, stopping me in my tracks. We've already wired this night's pay to your account. I pulled out my phone and saw the PayPal notification signaling that $2,000 had landed safely in my account. I don't even know if they have my account details. That's how I started looking after MS. Ferguson's ashes. Damien explained that MS. Ferguson had died of a brain aneurysm. Right on that chair, he pointed. 3 weeks had passed before anyone noticed. The mailman came to deliver a letter one morning, and when he saw the unopened letters flooding the mailbox and smelting the stench of rot, he alerted the police. And there they found her body, slumped on that chair. No one was named in her will. Her only request was for her savings to be invested in her afterlife care, and for her ashes to be scattered at a beach. And so here we were. There were rules that I had to follow each night. Damien handed me a document that listed them all. Rule 1: ensure all doors and windows are securely locked by midnight. Do not open until the end of the shift. No exceptions. Rule 2: if you hear the sound of crying, remain perfectly still until it passes. Do not, under any circumstances, make a sound. Rule 3: do not sleep on the job. Rule 4: do not look into any mirrors after midnight. Rule 5: do not open the bedroom door at the end of the hallway. You must not under any circumstances break these rules. Alex, Damien finished. For the first time, the smile faded from his face. He was dead serious. Got it, I said. My schedule was the same each night. I polished the tables, vacuumed the carpets, dusted the bookshelves, and played MS, Ferguson's favorite songs on the record player. She apparently loved jump blues music, so every night I played Boogie Woogie Boogle Boy back to back. For the most part, it was a decent job. I had no supervisor, so sometimes I just lay on the couch, watching Joe Rogan until sunrise. Then I'd clock out at 7 a.m. Rinse, repeat. I didn't hear the sound of crying until the fourth night. I was in the house all by myself. I remained as still as a mannequin, my heart beating in my chest. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear, as I heard the sobbing. Sure, Damien did warn me about the crying, but I didn't expect it to actually happen. I strained my ears to listen, but the sound was faint and muffled like it was coming from inside the walls themselves. It was almost as though they didn't want anyone to hear. But then the crying got louder and louder. And then it was followed by the sound of scratching. Nails were scratching furiously from inside the walls. That was the last straw. As soon as the crying stopped, I got out of there. I left the house keys under the doormat. My phone was ringing up a storm as I reversed out of the driveway. Damien must have been alerted that the door was opened. I put it on the loudspeaker and pressed the gas pedal to the floor. "What are you doing, Alex?" There was no more politeness in Damien's voice. "I'm quitting. Don't worry, I'll pay back tonight's wage. But I've entertained this crazy shit long enough. Mister, Adami, you're making a mistake. Listen, I'm not spending one more night in that madhouse. There are rules, you broke them. Please don't call me again. Mister Adami, I urge you to..." I hung up the phone. When I finally stepped through my front door, the familiar warmth of home began to ease my nerves. I collapsed to sleep on the sofa. Later that morning, I woke up to the sound of soft footsteps. Celine was already up by 7 in the morning, her eyes full of concern as she gently shook my shoulder. "Hey," she said, her voice a soothing balm. "You okay? You look like you barely slept." She handed me a cup of coffee. I rubbed my eyes and managed to manage a tired smile. Rough night, I admitted, the memories of the care home still fresh in my mind. She frowned, worry etched across her face. "You don't have to keep pushing yourself so hard," she said, kissing me on the forehead. "We can figure things out together." I know I reached for her hand. I just want everything to be perfect for us. It already is. As long as we're together, she squeezed my hand and smiled gently. "I just had my performance review. I have been pushing for that senior product manager role. If I get it, it'll make things a little easier for us." "That's great, babe. I know you'll get it." She probably noticed how distracted I was. "Are you sure you're okay, Lex?" From that point forward, I heard nothing more from Damien. No text messages, no calls, radio silence. The job posting is no longer live on Indeed. And I didn't have the man's number, so calling him wasn't an option. I wanted to clear the air to make sure he wouldn't break into my house one night and slip cyanide into my coffee. The silence was killing me. The uncertainty and the dread of not knowing what he was thinking. I drove back to MS Ferguson's house, but there was no one there. Someone had stuck up a for sale sign on the lawn. It was as if the whole ordeal had never happened. 4 nights that were blotted out of history. Life went back to usual for the most part. At that point, I hadn't told Celine what had happened. Not about the special requirements of the job, the weird rules, or the muffled crying I heard from inside the walls. I didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plates. I convinced myself that everything would go back to normal. I was wrong. One morning, as I got up to brush my teeth, I glanced in the mirror and saw the reflection of an old lady standing behind me. I spun around and saw no one there. But when my eyes drifted back to the mirror, there she was again. Impossibly thin and frail, draped in a tattered nightgown, leaning on a cane. Her eyes were red and teary. She had been crying. At the office, I'd see her lithe frame in toilet mirrors. Her silent eyes were now dead, as though she had run out of tears. There she was in the corner of my bedroom at night, her silhouette lurking in the dark, walking aimlessly, drifting in the corner of my eyes. But when I looked directly at her, she'd vanish again. Everywhere I went, I'd hear the tap, tap, tap of that cane as she followed me. But she was invisible to everyone else. It didn't take long for me to start losing my appetite. I ate less. My eyes became sunken and hollow from the sleepless nights. I lost some weight and my face was gaunt. I stopped going to the office because I was terrified. I locked myself in my house and hid under the covers. That was the only place I was safe from her. I had no choice but to confess everything to Celine. She did what she could to support herself. She set up appointments with a therapist, stayed awake with me after my night terrors, and took time off work to be around more. But still, I drifted slowly into the deep end of madness. We ended up canceling the wedding. But the torture didn't stop there. Soon I began seeing MS Ferguson's urn in random places too. I stepped into my bedroom one evening, and there it was, sitting on my nightstand as if it had always been there. Each time I found it, I tried to get rid of it, moving it to the attic, locking it in the basement, even throwing it out with the trash. But no matter what I did, it always returned undisturbed and pristine. And if it wasn't the urn haunting me, it was the old lady with that cane of hers. Tap, tap, tap. Maybe she's trying to tell you something, Celine suggested one night. We were lying on the sofa together as I ran my hand through her hair. MS Ferguson was staring at us from the corner of the room. I tried to ignore her. Is she here with us now? Celine asked. Yeah, she's right there. I pointed to beside the dining room table. I could see that made Celine uneasy. She shifted slightly, her body tensing. Perhaps she just needs something to be at peace, Celine added, her eyes lingering on the corner of the room. Perhaps I was suddenly reminded of MS Ferguson's will. She wanted her ashes to be scattered on a beach. I might have an idea. That following morning, I stepped out of my front door for the first time in what felt like an eternity. I squinted at the blinding sunlight, feeling the fresh morning breeze on my face. It was a 50-mile drive to the closest beach. The open road stretched out ahead, winding through coastal towns and past towering cliffs, laced with wildflowers swaying in the gentle breeze. MS Ferguson's urn was riding shotgun on the front seat. The world outside my car seemed to slow down. You have a lot of time to think about everything when you're out on the road. And that whole journey, all I could think about was MS Ferguson. I had so many questions. What did she do for a living? Did she have any children? Was she ever married? Why did she want her ashes to be scattered at the beach? I never cared to ask Damien any of these questions, but all of a sudden these things seemed to hold more weight, more value. Finally, the beach appeared in the distance, a stretch of sand bordered by rugged cliffs and soft waves. I parked the car and stepped out onto the sand, the grains warm beneath my feet. The wide ocean stood before me, stretching into the distance forever. The sun was still climbing over the horizon. I hired one of the small boats from the fishermen and paddled it out until I was far out in the calm waters. I sat there for a moment with MS Ferguson's ashes. It was quiet out there. Nothing but the lapping of the waves, the faint cries of the seagulls above, and the breeze of the wind. All you wanted was to be cherished by someone, I said to no one in particular. Then it all hit me. All of my emotions collided like a car speeding into oncoming traffic. The fear, the sleepless nights, the confusion, the numbness, all of it mingled with a deep sense of sadness. The sadness I felt for MS Ferguson. For all the years she felt alone, isolated, and forgotten. Tears fell from my eyes before I realized I was crying. With trembling hands, I opened the urn. I'm sorry. It must have been so lonely and so painful, I said. But this isn't where you belong. You can let go, you can find peace now. I scattered her ashes into the sea, and as I watched them drift away, I felt a heaviness lift off my shoulders. I never saw MS Ferguson again after that. I work at a toll booth on a lonely country road. Please stay away. I'm sure the first thing you think of when you hear toll booth is the great inconvenience of your trip being interrupted to be charged a few bucks just to pass through. The mental image most of you might conjure is a clogged up freeway with lines of cars packed together, waiting to pay and move on. I can imagine the people who work at those booths find it even more boring than you do. The one I work at couldn't be further from the stereotype. The toll booth I operate is situated on a small country road that curves a few times along its path through the woods surrounding it, far away from any bustling highway. The booth itself is more like a little wooden shack, with chipped paint and an old sign that reads 25C, an amount I don't believe has changed since sometime in the 50s. I guess that's when they decided to stop pretending it was a normal toll booth. Its only accessory is the barrier arm, which I can flip up or down. The interior is simple, with a single chair and a light on the ceiling, the only light besides the moon for miles. It only has one operator on any given night most nights. That's me. On the surface, it doesn't make sense why our local government would pay someone to sit out in the middle of nowhere to operate a booth that makes no money, and believe me, they pay well. But if you spent a single night out there, you would understand why. No, there isn't a sudden influx of 1,000 cars waiting to pay their tolls at 3 a.m. What we protect by keeping this booth running is worth far more than any monetary cost could make up for. In my town, the job of operating the lonely booth is one that is highly respected and rarely spoken of. In fact, it's something of an unspoken rule that you keep private any conversations about the booth, the road, or anything related. Everyone around here knows there's something off about this place. Almost everyone has seen something they can't explain or something they wish they hadn't. A lot of rural towns have their own urban legends. Most of the time, their residents embrace the myths. I suspect it's because they all know it's a myth, save for a few crazies. Our town is the opposite. We keep quiet about the things we've seen. The most we can do around here is steer people clear of the road and hope nothing strays from it. The last we wanted was for the rest of the world to find out, and I suspect we're not the only ones. You see, our town is doing far better than most in our area. Our infrastructure never seems to crumble or degrade, our public schools are well funded, and no one is ever stuck looking for work. The reason this is noteworthy is that our town isn't exactly in the most prosperous region of America. This money is coming from somewhere, and it's not from our little property taxes. I've got a suspicion that the feds or someone else is dumping money into our town, and that they're keeping tabs on our little toll booth situation as well. I know this all sounds ridiculous now, but once you get a better idea of my job and of recent events, I think you'll understand. As I said, the booth only has one operator each night, a tradition that goes as far back as we've been a town. Each week we hold a private meeting at our town hall. At this meeting are all current toll booth attendants and any former ones who can make it. Most of the time, the meetings don't last longer than 15 minutes, but after the emergency meeting I called a few weeks ago, we've held them every day, and they've been taking a lot longer. The reason for which you will know soon enough. I suppose this is a good time to explain what happens at the toll booth and the road it sits on. You'll need to know my rules. Rule 1, the booth does not need to be attended during the day. Not much happens at the booth when the sun is up, but the attendant for the night, which is usually me, must be at the booth an hour before sunset and stay an hour after sunrise. The attendant for the night is not to leave the booth at any time during their shift, for any reason. Transportation isn't an issue because either the sheriff or one of the deputies always gives us a ride to the booth at night and a ride back to town in the morning. Rule 2, no cell phone, radio, or other electronic or communication device is allowed while operating the booth at night. The only thing running on electricity that a booth attendant is allowed to have is a flashlight. If you happen to bring a device accidentally, shut it off, store it inside the booth, and pray that it doesn't turn itself back on. Leaving it outside the booth is not an option. Should your device turn itself on inside the booth, your next best bet is to destroy it. This sounds like a drastic measure, but I've made this mistake before. It lasted about an hour before I couldn't take the screams coming from my phone and stomped it into oblivion. I haven't made the mistake of taking it with me again. I've never been told what the screams and other noises are, but I do know that past attendants have heard the same thing. Rule 3, as rare as they are, cars may approach the gate at any time during the night. A common trait among those who end up on this road at night is confusion. The attendant's job is to decide whether they will be let through or turned away. The driver, along with confusion, may express other emotions. They may be distressed, angry, paranoid, or fearful. Try to calm them down and put their minds at ease as best you can. Once you believe they are ready, you will simply ask them to pay their toll. One of two outcomes will occur. If the driver has no notable reaction, questions you, or hands you a regular quarter, you must leave the barrier arm down and turn it away. Do whatever is necessary to try and make them leave. If they threaten you or attempt to drive through anyway, you can let them know you will be calling the police, even though you have no means of calling them. This scenario is unlikely because no modern navigation system would bring them down this road. All of the locals know not to use it, and it would be unusual for an outsider to learn about it. Though we have, on occasion, had to deal with a few lost travelers, most of the time they are compliant. Get them off the road as soon as possible and direct them towards town, where they can get their footing. Above all else, they cannot pass through the gate. However, if you ask them to pay their toll, another outcome is possible, and unfortunately, the most common. They'll come to a sudden realization, as evidenced by their facial expression. It's as if they remember something, slowly reaching into their pocket and pulling out a black coin. They know they'll have to give it to you to pass. Some accept their fate graciously, others cry. But they all follow the road once the barrier arm is lifted. Around the corner, they drive, never to be seen again. In my first months working here, I was confused as to who these people were. I wondered what it was they knew, how they got these coins in the first place, or what the coins were. All I knew was to leave it in the booth to be picked up by the next shift. This was until I happened to be watching the local news one morning after I got home. They talked about a man who was killed in a car accident the night before, and showed a picture of his face. A face I had seen only hours before, puzzled and afraid as he asked me where he was and what was going on. When I asked him for his toll, he froze, slowly reached into his coat pocket with a quivering hand, and pulled out a black coin before placing it in mine. He gripped the steering wheel and faced forward, knowing he had to pass through and drive around the corner. He knew where he was going. Sitting in my living room that morning, recounting the events of the last hours, I realized that I was the last person to see that man. He was already dead, he was just passing through. As were the dozens I had seen before, and the countless more I knew I would see. It was the moment I realized the road was some kind of path to somewhere beyond. As for this rule, I don't believe anyone has ever stopped the dead from passing when their time has come. I don't think anyone ever could. It's something so surreal that, at the moment, all you can do is let autopilot take over and continue with your duties as you were told. But as for letting the living through, I'm afraid it has been done before. A few decades ago, a visitor from out of town was passing through town. Back then, he didn't have a phone to give him directions, so he had to go off a map. Even with a map, I'm certain he didn't know the road because it was never put on any map. My best guess is that he happened to see it and figured it could be some sort of shortcut. When he approached the gate, he was, of course, turned away by the toll booth attendant, but he wasn't taking no for an answer. The man got violent with the attendant, pushing him over and raising his arm himself before driving through. This hadn't happened before, at least as far as any of the past attendants of the booth who were still alive could recollect. No one was sure what would happen next. Back then, they only knew the rules, not the consequences, but they didn't have to wait long to find out. The next night, the same man in the same car rolled up to the booth. When asked for his toll, this time he presented a black coin. He seemed to have lost his memory of the night before, only knowing that he needed to pass through, but not why. This has continued every night for the last several decades. Each night he pulls up, confused as to why he's here and needs to pass, and forgets each time. Each night he gives us a coin. Each time he passes on, driving around the bend into the woods, he is not seen until the next night. He never ages, and his appearance never changes. Sometimes he even says the same exact thing as the night before. Other times he expresses a sense that he's been here before and that everything feels familiar, like he almost remembers sometimes. His fate is one I wouldn't wish upon my worst enemies. Dead, but not being allowed to move on, and never remembering why you're there, living the same moment night after night until who knows when. His story is one that reminds me of the importance of our job here, but not the only one. Rule 4, at some random point in the night, you may hear something moving through the trees, something big. Sometimes they emerge from the woods, other times they'll be coming down the road. Try not to be afraid. No harm is coming your way, quite the opposite. However, I can see how this would be hard to believe. In any case, you need to raise the arm and let them through. I remember the first time I saw them. I could hear a clop somewhere down the road, coming towards the booth like a horse galloping. I rose to my feet and grabbed my flashlight, intrigued. I remember hoping it wasn't someone's horse. I had never been told what to do in that scenario. When I did point my flashlight at the road, I nearly had a heart attack at the sight before me. A bull moose was approaching with a brisk walk. Of course, I was warned of this, but the details I was given were vague. All I was told was that a moose might approach the gate, and I was supposed to let it through. I wasn't told that this thing stands at around 9 or 10 feet at the shoulder, or that its fur is so dark I couldn't see it without my flashlight, save for the massive antlers, which are white as snow in contrast. The only other part of its body clearly visible from afar were its eyes, which shone with a small speck of white light glowing in the darkness. I screamed and retreated to my booth, tempted to run off into the night and abandon my post. Fortunately, the moose slowed its pace and eventually stopped in front of the barrier arm. This calmed me down, and I slowly raised it, watching as the moose approached to pass. As it did, I noticed the halter and reins on its head. I followed them up, only to meet another set of eyes, identical to the moose's, towering over me. Again, I yelled but contained my volume when I realized whoever or whatever this was on top of the moose was making eye contact with me as they passed. This figure was dark, if not darker than the moose it rode on, something akin to a shadow. Just like everyone in their cars, they walked down the road beyond the bend and out of sight. I had to sit down for half an hour before I stopped shaking. Needless to say, I wasn't very happy that those finer details had been left out. Only after my shift and expressing my frustration was I told more. Apparently, this hunter and his moose have been around a long time. So long that no attendant alive today can remember a time without them. Some believe they've been here for the past couple hundred years or more, possibly as long as the strange road and the booth have been around. What we do know is that they aren't bound to the road like the others. At our town hall, we possess a written account of the hunter and his mount riding right through town in the middle of the night, back in 1919. To this day, a few residents have seen the moose while they're driving at night. You may be wondering why I refer to the figure on the moose's back as the hunter. Well, that's what we attendants call him. Every so often, he and his moose will arrive at the booth, dragging a corpse behind them. When I say corpse, I don't mean an animal, or even a human, for that matter. I mean abominations out of your wildest nightmares. Things that send a shiver down your spine and make you want to vomit at the same time. Things you would expect to find talked about in a religious text when the end of days comes. The hunter drags these things down the road and around the curve. I can't be certain of anything, but if you ask me, he's taking them back to some sort of afterlife or underworld. Maybe it's the same place the dead go when they drive around the curve, or maybe somewhere in the road is a pathway to many different places. I couldn't tell you. What I believe, like the other attendants and anyone who knows about the hunter and his moose, is that they're here to protect us. Whatever these things are that he's taking with him aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and he's just here to set things right. Now, this is where we get to the point why I'm telling you about all of this. I explained before that the people in my town like to keep these things quiet, and for the most part, I agree. I'm not a fan of airing our business to the outside world. It's attention we don't need. Unfortunately, I don't think we have a choice this time. It began a couple of weeks ago during one of my shifts at the booth. Everything was going well for the most part. No new dead passed through that night, nor did any living try. The only customer I had was our regular. Poor old bastard, confused as ever. After him, all was quiet for a few hours until I heard a slow clop coming down the road yet again. These days, I'm not afraid anymore. I've seen the hunter and his moose enough times that I don't fear either of them, and like I said, I've come to respect them for the things they take out of this world. The one thing I often fear is the sight of whatever it is they're dragging out. That night was no exception. They approached the gate and stopped in front of it. Before I moved to raise the barrier arm, I shone my flashlight at the rope being dragged behind and the dreadful thing attached. The end of the rope was tied in a knot around an enormous pair of cloven hooves, hooves that belonged to what looked like the lower half of some sort of deer. As I moved up the body with my flashlight, I quickly discovered that this wasn't just some massive buck. The legs may have been reminiscent of one, but the upper body was that of a man. A man in a striped red and blue clown suit. The sleeves were shredded at the wrist, and protruding from them were long, blackened hands with claws for fingers. The head was by far the most grotesque part. Its nose and mouth, like the rest of its head, were covered in the skin like that of a pale man, but their shape was that of a deer's. Blood dripped out of its half-open mouth. The ears were similar, with the same pale color and texture as a man's but shaped like a deer's. It was like someone took human ears and stretched them out, morphing them to fit the disgusting shape they desired. On top sat a red and blue jester hat, and a set of antlers sprouted out above them. I froze for a moment upon seeing the entirety of this beast, but snapped out of it when I reminded myself that I had a job to do, and that I better do it if I didn't want to see this thing any longer. I walked over to the barrier arm and raised it. The moose resumed its trot forward along the road and past the gate. As they passed me, I couldn't help but watch the deer clown monster it was dragging behind. A streak of blood followed on the road behind it. Right before it passed by the booth completely, I lit up its face with my flashlight to get a final look. Its eyelids shot open, revealing the black and brown eyes underneath. Then it opened its mouth and let out a loud, pain-filled bleat before it leaned down and clawed at the knot holding its hooves. In only a few seconds, the ropes were cut, and the beast attempted to stand. It didn't get far in its initial attempt, however, because the bull moose in front of it struck its head with a powerful kick. Another splash of blood came from the clown's mouth, along with one of its teeth, as it fell back to the ground, seemingly knocked out for a moment. While it recovered, the hunter turned his moose around to face it head-on. I ran from the booth and hid behind a tree to the side of the road, but I kept an eye on the fight. Air shot from the moose's nostrils as it began to grunt. His grunts were louder and deeper than the bleats of the deer clown. I could feel my chest vibrate with each powerful grunt. The clown finally stood and stared back at the hunter and moose, letting a few more bleats out, as if to challenge them. At its standing height, this thing was taller than the moose, though it was obvious the moose was much larger and heavier overall. The moose lowered its head and charged. Before it connected, the clown thing attempted to claw at the hunter on its back, but failed. It was picked up off the ground by the moose's antlers and driven through a row of trees that came crashing down on top of it. The moose backed up a step and turned, allowing the hunter to throw a new rope around the clown's head. The moose charged away, with the hunter holding the new rope. They began to drag the clown by the neck, I assume hoping to finally make it around the bend this time. Unfortunately, it was still conscious and sliced the rope with its claws again. The clown didn't waste any time hurrying to its hooves and charging into the woods. The hunter and his moose followed. In only a moment, they were both out of sight. I only noticed my heavy breathing after all, which was quiet again. It took me an hour to work up the courage to leave the tree line and return to my booth. When I did, I noticed the tooth from the clown lying on the road and collected it. Fortunately for me, the rest of my shift was uneventful. Unfortunately, the hunter never returned with the clown. When the sheriff picked me up at sunrise, I told him to hurry to the town hall for an emergency meeting. During the drive, I contacted everyone else and told them to get there as soon as possible. At the meeting, I presented the tooth and gave an account of what I had just witnessed. There was a mix of emotions. None of the other attendants had ever seen something escape from the hunter before, and none knew what it meant. The agreed-upon action was to wait at least a week. It's unusual to not see the hunter and his moose for more than a week, so we figured he would catch the clown in the next couple of days and all would be sorted. I dearly wish that was what happened. A day later, a video surfaced on the internet from the town. It showed a pair of deer antlers sticking out above the tops of trees as the man recording was driving. A few days after that, another video. This one was recorded by a woman who awoke in the middle of the night to laughter outside. Halfway through the video, you can see the antlers and part of the hat outside of a second-story window. The woman recording didn't notice, but commenters on the video sure did. Last week, Someone halfway across the state uploaded a grainy photo of a black moose on a hill in a clearing between the trees, far off in the distance. These are just the ones I've seen. Now you can see why we've been having meetings every week. I can tell we're not the only ones in a panic either. Strangers started showing up around town, and not the kind that are just passing through. They try their best to fit in, but they stick out like a sore thumb. The dead giveaways when they show up to our bars and diners, striking up a conversation before asking folk what they've seen around here lately, asking about the booth and the strange road. In the last week or so, they've stopped trying so hard to hide it. Black government CVs have been crowding the parking spaces downtown. We kept the tooth in the town hall, along with every other document and record we have about the booth, and now it's all missing. It's clear that whatever happened that night wasn't supposed to happen, and we weren't the only ones who noticed. I didn't work last night, but the attendant who did had a lot to report this morning in our meeting. The feds drove out to the booth and took a look around. He pleaded with them not to drive through, but in response they told him they already knew why they shouldn't, something we weren't expecting. It's only a matter of time before they come for me. I suppose I'll tell them the truth when the time comes. As much as we'd like to keep it a secret in our town, the genie is out of the bottle. I figured I would at least tell all of you before the feds. Every one of you should know what's out there. As for me, I'll keep watching the booth at night. Sticking to my duties is about all I can do. Still, I'll be keeping up with all of the developments that I can. I can only guess based on the posts I've strung together, but it looks like the clown is still on the move, and our hunter is close behind. I can only pray that he catches it soon. In the meantime, if you hear strange laughter in your backyard at night, stay inside.